A powerful millionaire CEO, Ethan Blake, had everything, except the truth. One rainy morning, a little girl picked up his fallen papers, never knowing he was her father. And Ethan? He didn't know either. But when a music box plays a familiar lullaby and a storm traps them in darkness, secrets buried for years begin to surface. Why did her mother hide the truth? What will Ethan risk to win back a daughter he never knew existed? In a world where legacy demands sacrifice, will love be enough to rewrite fate? Before we dive into today's emotional story, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? I love knowing how far these stories are reaching, so drop your city and time in the comments. The wind howled through the glass towers of Manhattan like a restless spirit chasing memories, sweeping fallen leaves and forgotten receipts along the footpath outside Blake Enterprises. Ethan Blake stepped out of the revolving door in his signature sharp blue tailored suit, his tie perfectly knotted, briefcase in hand, heart burdened with the weight of deadlines and the loneliness that no wealth could cure. The moment his polished shoes touched the pavement, a cyclist swerved too fast around the corner, colliding into him and sending Ethan staggering backward as a thick folder burst open mid-air like a paper explosion. Dozens of confidential merger contracts, employee files, and handwritten notes scattered across the pavement like snowflakes of disaster. Pedestrians glanced, then moved along, indifferent to the chaos of a man in a $1,000 suit crawling after paper. One man laughed, another shook his head, not a single soul offered a hand. Ethan muttered under his breath, chasing one sheet after another, anger and embarrassment bubbling just below his calm exterior. But then, a tiny pair of shoes stopped in front of a flapping document. A small voice broke the noise. "I'll help you, mister," it said, innocent and warm. Ethan looked up. There, kneeling on the ground beside him, was a little girl in a bright pink dress, her golden hair tied in a loose ponytail, her blue eyes clear as the morning sky. Without hesitation, she bent down and began gathering the papers, holding them tightly in her tiny arms as if they were treasure maps. She didn't care about the suit he wore or the stares from strangers. "You dropped these," she whispered, carefully aligning the edges of the crumpled sheets. Ethan blinked, momentarily stunned by the purity in her gesture, unsure if she was real or a flashback from a forgotten dream. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice unusually tender. Her cheeks dimpled when she smiled, a kind of smile that reminded him of someone. As she reached to hand him the last paper, his gaze drifted to her wrist. A small glint of silver caught the sunlight. Time slowed. His breath caught in his throat. Wrapped delicately around her wrist was a bracelet. Not just any bracelet, the same one he had custom designed with a silversmith 9 years ago. A single sapphire set in a rose-carved charm, engraved with the initials GR, meant only for one person, Grace Rose, the woman who once held his heart and disappeared with it. His fingers trembled as he gently touched the charm, disbelief widening his eyes. Where did you get this?" he asked, barely above a whisper, voice cracking under the pressure of rising memories. The girl looked at him curiously, not understanding the panic in his tone. "It was Mommy's," she said softly, eyes glancing down at the heirloom. "She said it would keep me safe." The sidewalk noise faded into silence for Ethan. In that moment, the city vanished, replaced by a rush of old emotions: love, loss, regret. The noise of honking taxis, hurried footsteps, and barking vendors melted away. All he could see was the bracelet. And her eyes. Those eyes. His heart raced with unspoken questions. Could it be? Was she? No. It couldn't. It wasn't possible. Grace was gone. She left. No explanation, no letters, no calls. But then, why would this child with those eyes and that bracelet suddenly appear in front of him like a ghost from the past? "What's your name?" he asked, his voice steadier now but laced with desperate curiosity. She tilted her head, hesitated, then said, "Lila." The name hit him like a gust of wind, beautiful, soft, and strangely familiar. He blinked rapidly, trying to conceal the storm rising behind his eyes. "Do you live around here?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Just down the block with Mrs. Foster. Mommy's gone to the stars now." Ethan swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. The little girl didn't know what her presence had just awakened. She had no idea that the man she was helping was a billionaire with a hollow heart, a man whose empire couldn't fill the void that one woman had left behind. And now, right here on the cold concrete, fate had delivered him a mystery in a pink dress, holding not only his papers, but possibly his past. As she stood up and handed him the last paper, her fingers brushed his. Warmth surged through him like electricity. Before he could say more, she turned and ran toward the street corner, her golden hair bouncing behind her like rays of sunshine trailing a memory. Ethan stood frozen, holding the paper she gave him in one hand, and staring at the bracelet in the other. The city resumed its rhythm around him, unaware that a man who had everything just encountered the one thing he didn't know he'd been missing. A piece of himself in the form of a stranger's child. But deep in his gut, something screamed, "She's not a stranger, not even close." And the truth behind her identity was about to change everything. For a moment, Ethan Blake stood rooted to the sidewalk like a man caught between dimensions, one foot in reality, the other lost in a sea of memories. The sound of the city came rushing back, but his breath hadn't returned. His heart pounded as he stared at the empty corner where the little girl had vanished, her golden hair like sunlight disappearing into shadow. But the feeling her presence left lingered. Clutching the final sheet of paper she'd handed him, his fingers brushed against the edge of that haunting memory, the silver bracelet. He hadn't imagined it, he knew every curve of its design, the rose pattern, the sapphire at the center, the initials engraved delicately underneath, long hidden but never forgotten. His hand trembled as he rubbed his thumb across the spot where it had rested on her tiny wrist. A flood of emotion surged through him, disbelief, sorrow, and a strange kind of hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Where did you get this?" he had asked her, voice breaking like glass against stone. Her answer replayed in his head with unbearable clarity. "It was my mommy's. She said it's lucky." He closed his eyes as the name Grace sliced through his thoughts like a blade reopening an old wound. Grace Rose, the only woman he had ever truly loved, the only woman who had vanished from his life without a single goodbye. One day they were dreaming about a future together, the next she was gone. No trace, no call, no letter, no grave, just silence. Now, after all these years, a little girl had shown up, wearing her bracelet, carrying her eyes, and offering her kindness. He couldn't process it, it was too sudden, too surreal. But it wasn't coincidence. No part of it felt accidental, not the bracelet, not her timing, not her eyes, especially not her eyes. He looked down at his reflection in the chrome side mirror of the parked car beside him. For the first time in a long while, he looked lost, not like a CEO, not like a man in control, but like someone clinging to the edges of something precious that kept slipping away. The documents he had nearly panicked over now felt like ash in his hand. His empire could wait, that girl couldn't. He spun around and walked quickly in the direction she had disappeared, dodging pedestrians, heart pounding like a war drum. He scanned the street, her pink dress, her golden hair, her tiny sandals. Nothing, only the blur of rushing strangers and city noise. He called out softly, "Little girl." But the name he didn't know made it feel hollow. He cursed under his breath. Why didn't I ask her name? He turned down an alley, then another, desperation growing like a vine around his chest. He checked every shop window, every crosswalk. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably his assistant wondering about the merge. Error. He ignored it. Nothing mattered right now, only her. But she was gone, vanished into the noise of the city just like her mother once had. His mind raced. Was it even possible? Could Grace have had a child? His child? No, that thought was too much. It was reckless, dangerous. But the bracelet, that unmistakable bracelet. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to the only thing he had never removed in 10 years, a small, faded photo of him and Grace, taken on the day he had given her that very bracelet. She had her head on his shoulder, laughing, alive, in love. The date was etched in his memory, the night she had whispered, "Forever, no matter what happens." And then, nothing, silence ever since. And now, fate had brought him a ghost with blue eyes and a pink dress. He sat on a bench near the corner where he last saw her, overwhelmed. His hand went to his temple, rubbing the stress into his skin. "What are you trying to tell me, Grace?" he murmured. "Why now? Why her?" He looked around again, eyes darting. The crowd was thicker now. The girl, Lila, maybe? No. He didn't even have that much. No name, no address, just a memory, a heartbeat, a mystery wrapped around a 6-year-old's wrist. He took a deep breath and stood, brushing off his coat. One thing was clear, this wasn't over. He would find her again. He had to. She might be the key to every question Grace had left behind. She might be carrying the truth he never stopped needing. And if she truly was his daughter, his stomach knotted at the possibility, not just because of what that would mean, but because of everything he'd already missed. Her first laugh, her first word, her first tear, all stolen by silence. But now, maybe now was a second chance. He pulled out his phone and opened the map, marking the street corner. Tomorrow he would start asking questions. Every building, every vendor, every local. He wasn't going to leave it to chance again, not like last time. He looked one last time down the block, where the late sun was casting golden light onto the city's stone faces. For a split second, he imagined her standing there again, her blue eyes looking up, that bracelet catching the light. And her voice, so soft, so haunting, echoing again. "It was my mommy's. She said it's lucky." Ethan exhaled, heart heavy, soul stirred. The papers may have scattered across the street, but something far more important had been uncovered. A truth buried by time. A past resurrected by a child's innocent kindness. And somewhere in the chaos of New York, that truth was walking in a pink dress, completely unaware that she had just shattered the world of a man who never stopped wondering why she never came back. Ethan barely slept that night. The soft ticking of the clock on his penthouse wall echoed like a metronome counting down something precious he might never recover. He paced from window to window, looking down at the city lights, wondering if she was sleeping somewhere safe, or if she even knew the impact she'd had on him. Her bracelet haunted him like a melody stuck in his bones, playing every time he closed his eyes. He could still hear her voice, her soft footsteps, the way her tiny fingers had carefully gathered the papers, like she was saving more than just paper. She was saving him from something far darker. Unable to contain his thoughts, he called Logan, his most trusted assistant. "I need access to the street cams on 5th and Lexington, yesterday, noon to 4. Logan hesitated. "Sir, that's private city surveillance. I'd have to pull strings." Ethan's voice dropped lower, firmer. "Pull them, and find every building nearby that has exterior footage, apartments, cafes, vendors. I need eyes on a 6-year-old girl in a pink dress. Start now." Logan didn't ask questions. He'd never heard Ethan sound like this, almost broken, but burning with urgency. As the night wore on, Ethan sat on the leather sofa, staring at the bracelet he now held. In his palm, he had traced its edges 100 times. The sapphire still shimmered, untouched by time, but its meaning had multiplied. He shut his eyes and suddenly he was no longer in his penthouse. He was back in Boston, 9 years ago. The smell of lavender, Grace's favorite perfume, filled the air. Her laughter danced across his memory. They were young, fearless, talking about baby names on that rainy Sunday when he gifted her the heirloom. "This is forever," she had whispered, her fingers lacing through his. But forever ended too soon. The memory shifted, her face turned pale, her voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Ethan." Then she vanished into smoke. He jolted awake, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. Morning light crept in, but it felt more like judgment than comfort. He had to find answers. He had to find her. By sunrise, Ethan was already dressed, sharply put together but hollow in the eyes. His driver parked a block away from the place where it all began, the spot where the papers scattered, and fate had rewritten his path. He stood there for hours, leaning against a lamppost, watching people pass, coffee in hand, phones glued to ears, mothers rushing with strollers, children tugging on backpacks, but none of them wore a pink dress, none of them had golden curls and sapphire eyes. He checked his watch for the 5th time, noon, the hour she had appeared yesterday. A vendor nearby began setting up his cart. Ethan approached him casually. "Excuse me, did you see a little girl in a pink dress around here yesterday?" The man blinked, thought for a moment, then shook his head. Sorry, mister, I see too many faces. Ethan thanked him and walked away, his hope dimming by the minute. Minutes stretched into hours. He ignored the calls from his board members. Emails piled up unanswered. None of it mattered. He was a billionaire without peace, a man with a void no stock could fill. He sat on the same bench he had collapsed onto the day before. The wind picked up again, and he glanced at the pavement, almost hoping the papers would scatter once more and summon her like magic. The clouds above grew heavy, mirroring his spirit. He rubbed his eyes and stood up. Maybe it was a sign, not a path, he muttered to himself. Just as he turned to leave, something in the corner of his eye pulled him back, a flash of pink, fleeting but vivid, disappearing into a narrow alley between two buildings. His heart slammed into his ribs. Without thinking, he rushed forward, weaving past pedestrians, ignoring honking cars as he sprinted toward the alley. His shoes echoed sharply against the pavement as he turned the corner. The narrow space smelled like old garbage and rain. "Hello," he called out, breathless. Silence. He took cautious steps, scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement. The alley split into two at the end. He stood frozen, unsure which way to turn. "Little girl?" he called again, softer this time. A cat darted out from behind a bin, startling him. He held his breath and listened. Then, faint, almost inaudible, a giggle. It was the kind of laugh that could only belong to a child. And he knew. He wasn't chasing shadows anymore. She was close. She was real. The soft giggle echoed again, delicate like a chime caught in the wind, guiding Ethan deeper into the narrow alley. He took slow, careful steps, his heart beating faster with each stride. The path twisted behind a dumpster, and there she was, sitting cross-legged on a patch of cardboard, her pink dress dusted with specks of the city, golden hair glowing faintly under the dim sunlight that managed to sneak through the gap in the buildings. Her back was turned to him, but he recognized her instantly. She was tearing small pieces from her sandwich and placing them gently on the ground in front of a scruffy, shivering stray dog. The sight stopped him cold. She didn't flinch or run, she just whispered to the dog, "You're hungry too, huh?" and offered another piece. The dog wagged its tail slowly, as if understanding her kindness. Ethan's throat tightened. This little girl had nothing, and yet gave everything. He slowly stepped forward, voice soft as he spoke. "We meet again, little helper." She turned around, eyes lighting up like morning sky over water. "You again?" she beamed, wiping her hands on her dress. "Did you drop more papers today?" A chuckle escaped his lips, foreign and unfamiliar. It had been years since laughter came naturally. "Not today," he said, kneeling beside her. "But I couldn't forget the girl who saved my entire week." She shrugged playfully. "They were just papers." "To you maybe," he replied, still mesmerized by the innocence in her gaze. "To me, they were the only thing keeping my life in place, until I met you." The dog lay down beside her, resting its head on her lap. She stroked it gently. "He follows me sometimes," she whispered. "I think he misses my mommy too." Ethan's expression shifted, caught off guard. He hesitated, then asked softly, "Where's your mom, sweetheart?" She looked up at the sky, her voice gentle but hollow. "She's in her star house now, up high. She said it's beautiful there." The words hit him like a wave crashing against a cliff. His breath stilled. He stared at her, stunned. "Your mommy? She passed away?" She nodded slowly, her tiny fingers curling around the fraying fabric of her dress. "She got really sleepy and didn't wake up, but she told me not to cry. She said she'd still watch me, every night, from the sky." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes, but he blinked them back. The name caught in his throat. Grace. Could it be? Was she truly gone? His hands clenched slightly, hiding the tremor building in them. "And where do you live now?" he asked, voice tender, low. "With Mrs. Foster," she replied. "She lives in the brown building near the bakery. Mommy said Mrs. Foster would keep me safe if anything ever happened." Ethan nodded slowly, mind spiraling with questions. "Do you like staying there?" The girl gave a half smile. "She's nice, but she's not mommy." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small pack of tissues, handing her one. She wiped her nose with a soft thank you, then offered him the last bite of her sandwich. "You hungry, mister?" He laughed again, touched by the offer. I'm okay, but that's very kind of you. She tilted her head. You're not like the other grown-ups, most just walk past, but you talk nice. He swallowed hard. I think you're very special. She looked down at the bracelet again. Mommy gave me this before she went to the stars. She said I should wear it always, so I won't forget her hugs. His eyes lingered on it, aching. Did your mommy ever talk about your dad? She paused, thoughtful. No, I asked once. She cried, so I never asked again. His heart broke all over again, hearing that. If you could meet him, what would you say? He asked, unsure why he even voiced it. She blinked. I'd ask him why he didn't come find me. I'd ask if he forgot I exist. Ethan's face twitched as he turned away briefly, hiding his reaction. The guilt gnawed deeper, even though he never knew she was born. You think my daddy's out there somewhere? She asked suddenly. He took a deep breath, steadying his voice. I think, if he knew how amazing you are, he'd be running through every alley in the world to find you. She smiled again, and the alley somehow felt warmer. Maybe he's lost too. Maybe, Ethan said softly, more to himself than her. A long pause stretched between them, gentle and quiet. Then she stood up, brushing off her dress. I gotta go before Mrs. Foster worries. He nodded quickly. Wait, can I walk you back? She hesitated, then nodded, reaching for his hand with complete trust. It fit perfectly in his. And as they stepped out of the alley, side by side, he realized, this wasn't just a path back to her home, it was a path back to his own heart. Ethan stood in front of a weathered brownstone. Hands clenched in his pockets, heart thudding against his ribs like a war drum. He wasn't a stranger to business deals or high-stake negotiations, but today, this doorstep felt heavier than any. Boardroom. He adjusted his collar, exhaled deeply, and rang the bell. The creaky door opened a few inches, revealing a woman with silvery hair tied in a loose bun and tired but observant eyes. Yes? She asked, not unkindly, but clearly wary. I'm Ethan Blake, he said, his voice calm but shaking underneath. I'm here on behalf of a local outreach program. We're offering support to guardians of children. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him as if peeling layers. So, you're Ethan Blake, she said slowly, almost to herself, and pushed the door open wider. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. You know who I am? Mrs. Foster gave a dry chuckle as she led him inside the modest, dimly lit home. Hard not to, when your face is on half the buildings in Manhattan. He tried to respond with a polite smile, but confusion sat heavily on his face. You knew Grace, he finally said, unable to dance around it any longer. Mrs. Foster paused, then nodded solemnly. She was my neighbor, and my friend. I was with her till the end. The words punched the air from his lungs. He sank slightly into the old wooden chair she offered, hands gripping the edge as if for balance. End? He whispered, dreading the answer. Mrs. Foster folded her hands in her lap, voice trembling now. Grace passed away 2 years ago, quietly. Illness took her slowly, cruelly. Ethan shut his eyes. The image of Grace, vibrant, laughing, full of mischief, cracked into fragments. I didn't know, he croaked. Why didn't she tell me? Why did she vanish without a word? There was silence before Mrs. Foster stood up and walked to a worn cabinet, pulling out a box filled with old letters. She wanted to, but she was scared, she said softly. She thought you moved on, that your empire, your world, didn't have space for her anymore. That's not true, Ethan said quickly, his throat tight. I searched for her, and I thought she left me. I never knew why. She believed contacting you would only hurt you, Mrs. Foster replied gently. Grace wasn't just sick, she was scared of being a burden. He looked at the floor, jaw clenched, pain crashing through him like waves on a broken shore. I never stopped loving her, he murmured, barely audible. I know, Mrs. Foster said, surprising him. I saw the way she looked at your photo. She never stopped loving you either. Tears pricked the edges of his eyes, but he blinked them away. Then why keep Lila from me? The room fell into a heavy hush. Mrs. Foster sighed, wiping her palms on her apron. Grace made me promise. She said if anything happened to her, I'd care for Lila and never tell you. She thought, protecting your future meant staying out of it. Ethan leaned forward, voice cracking. But she's my daughter, isn't she? Mrs. Foster hesitated. I deserve to know the truth, he said, eyes locked on hers. Please. Mrs. Foster slowly nodded. I can't say for certain, but Grace told me she only ever loved one man. That bracelet was her goodbye. Lila's your mirror, Ethan. A tear slipped down his cheek. She has your eyes. He looked away, swallowing the storm inside. I saw it. The first moment we locked eyes. It was like seeing Grace again. The older woman handed him an envelope, faded and sealed with a trembling hand. Grace wrote this the day before she passed. I never had the courage to send it. Ethan held it like it was made of glass, unsure if opening it would shatter him or heal him. She wanted Lila to know you, eventually, but on her terms, Mrs. Foster whispered. He stared at the letter, heart thundering with decades of what-ifs. Will you let me talk to her? He asked gently. Not as a CEO, not even as her father, just a man who wants to know her. Mrs. Foster studied him. She's a sensitive child. She talks to the Atis Tars every night, thinking Grace listens. Ethan's lips quivered. I want to be someone she doesn't have to look up to find. Silence again. Then the faint sound of a little laugh from upstairs. Mrs. Foster smiled faintly. She's home. You can stay for dinner. Ethan stood, knees weak but spirit braced. Thank you for keeping her safe. The woman nodded. Don't thank me. Just don't waste what you've been given. As she called out for Lila, Ethan clutched the letter to his chest, feeling the weight of lost years and the fragile hope of what could come next. Ethan stepped out of Mrs. Foster's modest home with a heart heavier than it had ever been, the night air wrapping around him like a question he couldn't yet answer. His feet moved, but his mind remained frozen, replaying Grace's name, her final wish, her voice fading in Mrs. Foster's words. He sat in the back seat of his luxury car, but didn't order the driver to move, just stared out at nothing as the streetlights painted long shadows across the windshield. Inside his breast pocket was a small photo he had taken of Lila's drawing, a messy sketch of a tall man in a blue suit labeled, "My Superhero." He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he called a private medical contact and arranged a discreet DNA test. He needed answers, but couldn't shatter the fragile hope growing in his chest. Ethan felt guilt wrap around him like chains. Was it betrayal to test something so pure? But the truth was no longer just about curiosity, it was about responsibility. He returned to Mrs. Foster the next day with soft eyes and a bouquet of fresh tulips, saying it was for her garden, though she didn't have one. She eyed him curiously but didn't question his presence. Lila burst through the door moments later, arms flailing in excitement. You came back, she squealed, running straight into his arms as if she had known him her whole life. Ethan knelt and hugged her back, stunned at how something so small could make his world feel big again. Thought we could visit the park today, he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her eyes lit up like sunrise. Can we feed the ducks? They did. They bought a bag of cracked corn from a vendor and sat by the pond tossing pieces into the water. Lila laughed at how the ducks quacked like grumpy uncles, and Ethan laughed too, more than he had in years. She told him about her dreams, to be an astronaut, a cupcake maker, and a firefighter, all at once. Every word from her mouth felt like music, and he just listened, trying to memorize her voice. Later that day, they returned to Mrs. Foster's. Lila insisted on showing Ethan her room. Inside, the walls were filled with hand-drawn stars, taped construction paper hearts, and one photo of Grace, smiling and radiant. Lila pointed. That's Mommy. She said stars help her talk to me. Ethan's throat closed. He forced a smile, nodding slowly, heart pounding. As Lila grabbed her crayons, she patted the floor. Draw with me. He sat cross-legged, letting her hand guide his. She drew stick figures, one tall, one tiny, with a huge sun behind them. She colored the tall one in a bright blue suit and gave him a smile. That's you. You're my superhero with papers. Ethan froze. The innocence in her voice shattered something deep in him. He turned his face slightly, hiding the tears that had silently crept down his cheek. Do you like it? She asked, unsure. I love it, he whispered. It's the best picture I've ever seen. Later that evening he read her a story, The Little Engine That Could, and watched her eyes slowly close, her fingers still clutching his sleeve. Mrs. Foster walked in quietly and saw the scene, Ethan beside the bed, hand resting on Lila's, his face more peaceful than she'd ever seen. "She's never opened up to anyone like this before," she said softly from the doorway. Ethan nodded, eyes still on Lila. "She's incredible." Mrs. Foster walked over and touched his shoulder. "Grace would have wanted this." He at her eyes and nodded again, this time with conviction. The next morning, the envelope arrived, plain, sterile, terrifying. It felt heavier than it should, like it contained not just data but destiny. Ethan stared at it for minutes in his office, the morning sun hitting the edges of the table. He picked it up, put it down, picked it up again. His fingers trembled as he slid the seal open, his breath shallow and quiet. The page inside was crisp, clinical, heartless. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. The words burned into his eyes, everything around him vanishing for a moment. He leaned back, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She was his daughter, his blood, his legacy. Tears streamed freely now, mixing relief, grief, and overwhelming joy. But he didn't rush to tell her. Something in him said, "Not yet." He needed to do it right. Not like a confession, but a promise. Instead, he folded the paper, placed it in his drawer, and sat still. Lila deserved a father, but she also deserved safety, stability, and love, not another whirlwind. He would show her, through actions, not announcements. He called Mrs. Foster that afternoon. "I'd like to come by again, if that's okay." She said yes. That evening they made cookies together. Lila giggled as flour dusted Ethan's suit. She fed him one with a toothy grin. "Yours is too burnt, you get that one." He laughed and pretended it was delicious. As they sat in the warm kitchen, Lila looked up at him and asked, "Why do you come back?" Ethan blinked. "Because someone very special is here." Lila leaned her head on his arm. "I'm glad you're my friend." He swallowed hard. "Me too, Lila." The envelope remained locked in his desk. The truth was known, but not yet spoken. In the silence of the night, as he replayed her smile and her words, Ethan made a vow. Not just to be present, but to be the father she never knew she was waiting for. Ethan sat at the edge of the bed, the unopened music box resting gently in his hands, his thumb grazing the tiny rose-shaped clasp, as if it held the power to turn back time. The DNA test was definitive. Lila was his, but the truth weighed heavier than any verdict he'd ever received in the boardroom. How do you tell a child you've been missing from her entire life? He could feel Grace's voice echoing in his ears, the soft way she used to hum the lullaby when they lay beneath the stars, back when dreams felt within reach. But that dream had vanished, stolen by time, silence, and a goodbye letter she never left. His throat tightened as he turned the key on the music box and let the melody spill out like a whisper from the past. It filled the quiet apartment with a haunting gentleness, a tune so familiar it hurt. In the room down the hall, Lila froze. The moment the notes floated to her ears, something deep inside her stirred. Her little fingers clenched the blanket as memories, blurry and precious, danced at the edge of her thoughts. She slid off the bed, bare feet padding softly on the floor as the melody drew her forward like a thread stitched through her soul. She peeked into the dimly lit room where Ethan sat, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The music wrapped around them, a bridge suspended between yesterday and now. "That song," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's Mommy's song." Ethan's eyes flickered, startled by how much of Grace shone through the little girl, her voice, her curiosity, her quiet strength. He swallowed the lump rising in his throat and patted the spot beside him. "She used to sing it every night," he murmured, "even when the world outside was falling apart." Lila inched closer, her eyes wide with wonder and something else, something uncertain. "How do you know Mommy's song?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan looked down, then into her eyes. "Because I loved her too," he said, barely holding it together, "with everything I had." The room fell into silence again, but the melody continued, soft and persistent. Like Grace herself refusing to be forgotten. Lila looked at the music box, then at him. Did you know her before she went to the Sky House? Ethan nodded slowly. I knew her when she laughed. So loud the wind would stop to listen, when she believed the stars had messages only we could read. Lila tilted her head, processing. Did you miss her? The question pierced him. Every day, I searched for her in places she never went, in faces that weren't hers, and I never stopped. Lila held her small hands together tightly. Why didn't you come find me then? The words shattered through him like glass. He had no script for this, no speech prepared. Because I didn't know you existed. Your mommy wanted to protect you from me. Because she thought I'd forgotten her. But I didn't. I couldn't. Lila's lips quivered as she sat down beside him, her little body brushing against his. You're not bad. You talk like my mommy used to. You look sad like her too. A tear slipped down Ethan's cheek. I'm sad because I missed everything. Your first words, your birthdays, the way you hug your doll. And I can never get those back. She reached over and touched his hand, her tiny fingers barely wrapping around two of his. Are you my real daddy? Ethan paused, heart thudding. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never like this, never this raw, this innocent, this pure. Yes, he said, his voice breaking. I am. If you'll let me be. Lila looked down at the music box still playing, then up at him with tearful eyes. I think Mommy sent you. I asked her once, before I sleep, to find me someone who smells like her hugs. He smiled through the tears, broken and whole all at once. Do I smell like her hugs? Lila nodded slowly. You smell like stars, and something warm, like pancakes in the morning. They both laughed softly, the first shared laugh that felt like a step toward healing. Does this mean you'll stay? She asked, voice trembling with hope and fear. Ethan nodded. Forever, if you want me to. I don't ever want to lose you again. Lila stood up and opened her arms wide. Then hug me now, so I know you're really real. He scooped her into his arms, holding her close, his heart pounding with decades of missed moments. Her heartbeat against his chest felt like a lullaby more powerful than the music box. She fit perfectly into his arms, like the missing piece of his life had finally returned. I love you, Lila, he whispered into her hair, trembling. More than I ever knew was possible. She pulled back, her eyes bright. Then you're my hero, the one with papers, and songs, and hugs. Ethan laughed, wiping his tears. You're the hero, sweetheart. You saved me from a life without color. The music box wound down, the last note lingering in the air. Can we play it again tomorrow? She asked. He nodded. We can play it every night. I'll even teach you the words. She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Mommy would like that. Ethan closed his eyes and whispered into the silence. I hope she knows. We found each other. But deep inside, a storm still brewed. How many lies had Grace carried to her grave? And why? Was there more he didn't know? Holding his daughter tighter, Ethan vowed that the truth wouldn't stay buried much longer. Tomorrow, he would return to Grace's final resting place. And finally ask the questions that haunted him. But tonight, with Lila in his arms, he let the music carry them both to sleep. The wind howled outside like a ghost mourning through the hollow streets, lightning slicing the sky in furious streaks as rain beat down in chaotic fury, and Ethan's car swerved slightly as he gripped the wheel tighter, heart pounding not from the weather but from the panic rising in his chest. Lila. His thoughts raced as he remembered the old house on Oak Lane, where Mrs. Foster lived. He had to make sure they were safe. He had to see her, his daughter. Branches slapped against the windshield as the storm roared. Louder, and Ethan barely managed to steer into the driveway before leaping out into the downpour, his tailored coat instantly soaked, but he didn't care. He pounded on the wooden door, breathless, yelling her name over the crashing thunder until finally, the door creaked open and Mrs. Foster stood with a flashlight, eyes wide with relief and worry. She's inside, she said softly, voice trembling. She was scared when the lights went out. She's been calling your name. Those words made something break in Ethan's chest as he rushed past her, shoes squelching on the old wooden floorboards until he found Lila curled on the couch with a blanket, clutching her doll and trembling. "Ethan," she gasped, running into his arms without hesitation, and he lifted her, holding her tight, feeling the smallness of her body pressed against his heart like it belonged there all along. "I'm here," he whispered into her wet hair. "I'm not going anywhere." The candles flickered on the kitchen table, casting soft orange glows against the dark walls, and Ethan sat with Lila beside him, the storm outside forgotten for a moment as she leaned her head against his chest. "I was scared," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought the thunder would take me like it took Mommy." Ethan's arms tightened instinctively as tears pricked his eyes again. This child had faced so much, too much alone. "It won't," he said gently, brushing her hair back. "I'll protect you now, always." There was a silence between them then, thick like fog, broken only by the thunder rolling in the distance and the low hum of candlelight dancing across their shadows. And then she asked, so innocently, so sharply, "Why do you cry when you look at me?" Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat, because that question had been building in his heart like a dam ready to burst. He turned to her, eyes glistening, voice cracking as he answered, "Because I'm your dad." The words slipped into the room like broken glass. Sharp, shocking, irreversible. Lila blinked, her small hands fidgeting in her lap as her lips parted slightly, the meaning sinking in like slow rain into dry soil. You're my daddy?" she said, the words fragile and unsure. Ethan nodded, one tear sliding down his cheek as he choked on a sob. "Yes, baby. Yes, I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know." She stared at him, confusion and wonder clouding her face, and then, with a quivering voice, she asked, "Why didn't you come sooner?" His whole body trembled at the question, like the truth was a weight pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. "I didn't know you existed," he whispered, shaking his head. "If I had, I would have given up the world for you, everything. I never would have let a day pass without holding you." The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the ache of lost years and broken fate, until finally, Lila reached out and touched his face with her tiny hand. "You really mean that?" she asked, her voice thick with tears. "I've never meant anything more in my life," he said, his voice raw, honest, shattered and whole at once. She threw herself into his arms then, and he caught her, lifting her onto his lap as they sat wrapped together, her little arms around his neck, his heart finally finding its missing piece. The storm raged on outside, but inside, there was warmth, forgiveness, a fragile beginning blooming in the candlelight. "I missed you, even when I didn't know you," she whispered into his ear. "And I loved you, even before I knew your name," he replied, his voice trembling with all the weight of the years he lost. They stayed like that for what felt like forever, just a man and his daughter, time folding around them like a protective blanket. But fate, ever cruel, knocked again. His phone buzzed violently against the table, breaking the silence with its shrill urgency. He hesitated, holding Lila tighter, not wanting to break the moment. But Mrs. Foster nodded too, ward it with concern. "It might be important." Ethan answered, and the voice on the other end was cold, corporate, devoid of compassion. "Mr. Blake," said the board chairman sharply, "we need to discuss your recent behavior, emotional instability, neglecting duties. Tomorrow morning, emergency board meeting. Your chairmanship is in question." His stomach dropped, the warmth around him shattering like glass, the storm outside suddenly feeling like it had entered the room. He wanted to scream that nothing mattered more than this child in his arms, that she was his soul, not a distraction. But he only said, "Understood," before ending the call, his hands clenched so tight they went white. Lila looked up at him, sensing the shift in his energy, her big blue eyes full of worry. "Are you leaving?" she asked, voice trembling. He cupped her face gently, heart breaking all over again. "Never, not unless you ask me to." She smiled faintly, though her eyes still held questions. "Will they be mad that you're my daddy?" she asked innocently. He exhaled slowly, brushing a kiss on her forehead. "They can be mad all they want. I'm still yours." And for the first time in a long time, despite the thunder, the chaos and the consequences waiting at dawn, Ethan knew what truly mattered, and he wasn't going to lose her again. As the boardroom lights glared coldly above him, Ethan stood motionless, the weight of his life pressing down harder than any business merger or market collapse ever had. Behind the sealed doors, men in suits murmured about quarterly losses, public image, and emotional instability, their voices echoing like distant thunder after the real storm had already passed in his heart. He clutched the sealed report in one hand, proof of the truth that changed everything, and Lila's innocent words haunted him. "Why didn't you come sooner?" The chairman cleared his throat impatiently. "Mr. Blake, we need your final decision, sir. Your behavior has become concerning." And that was it, the moment Ethan had once feared but now faced with steel resolve. He straightened his tie, not out of pride, but finality, and stepped into the conference room, where 12 board members sat in judgment, their pens ready to sign away the soul of the company to anyone willing to put profit over people. Silence fell like a curtain as Ethan's footsteps tapped slowly against the marble, echoing across the vast room, until he stood at the head of the long table he'd once commanded with confidence, now feeling more like a courtroom defendant than a leader. He looked at each of them, one by one, not with resentment, but clarity, before finally speaking, his voice low, steady, and painfully human. "I've built this empire from nothing, turned dust into legacy, but somewhere along the way, I forgot what legacy really means." A few raised brows, some scoffed, others leaned forward with curiosity as Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the CEO security badge he'd once worn like armor. "This title, this chair, this board, it means nothing if it costs me the chance to be a father." Gasps whispered across the room like ripples in still water, but Ethan continued. "You want a man who can bury emotions beneath spreadsheets. I want to be the man who shows up for his daughter when she needs me." The chairman began to interrupt, but Ethan held up his hand, silencing him with a look of rare fire, unapologetic, unshaken. "If building an empire means abandoning what matters most, I want no part of it," he said, louder now, letting the truth ring out. And just like that, he placed the badge on the polished table, turned his back on everything he'd spent a lifetime building, and walked toward the glass exit as gasps and whispers filled the boardroom behind him. Every step away felt like a weight lifting, not loss, but freedom, and as he reached the tall glass doors, the faint sound of tiny footsteps caught his ear. There, just beyond the glass, stood Lila, in her worn pink sweater and blue jeans, her golden hair slightly damp from the earlier rain, her little hands clutching the same music box he'd given her nights ago. Their eyes locked, her face pressed against the old glass as if trying to see if he was really walking away, for her. For a second, time froze, the world, the company, the past, all blurred behind him, and all that remained clear was her, waiting. And then she ran, without hesitation, without words, straight into his arms as he stepped through the doors, and he knelt down just in time to catch her as she crashed into his chest, sobbing into his blazer, his arms wrapped around her like he'd waited forever to hold this exact version of love, this real, unfiltered moment. Neither spoke because they didn't need to. She had her answer, and he had his home. Ethan buried his face in her hair and whispered, "You're all that matters now. Everything else can burn." His voice trembling not from weakness, but overwhelming relief, and somewhere nearby, hidden behind a corner column, a photographer from a business magazine snapped a photo, unplanned, unrehearsed, untouched, of a former CEO, now just a man, on his knees in the arms of his daughter. That image, days later, would circle the globe, not as scandal, but as a symbol of something the world had long forgotten. That love, even in suits and skyscrapers, still wins if you let it. But in that moment, neither Ethan nor Lila knew or cared what the world would see. They only felt each other, the warmth of reunion washing over every scar of absence, and the quiet thunder of a man finally choosing heart over legacy. She ran into his arms with the force of every unspoken word they hadn't yet said. He bent down and caught her, lifting her as though she were the only thing anchoring him to life. Her tiny hands clutched the back of his blazer, pressing her cheek into his shoulder. For the first time in years, Ethan Blake smiled without pain trailing behind it. Board members behind the glass stared, stunned, but none dared interrupt. The flash of a photographer's camera caught the silhouette of a father reclaiming his purpose. Lila whispered, "You came back for me," and he nodded against her hair. "I'll never leave again," he promised, "not as a CEO, but as her dad. Time slowed, and for a heartbeat the world disappeared. Just a man and his daughter, finally whole. Weeks turned to months, and the headlines faded. But in the quiet aftermath, Ethan built something far more lasting than a company. The city buzzed with whispers of the new Grace Foundation, named after a woman who once gave him love without conditions. It stood tall in the heart of downtown, stone, glass, and stories behind every brick. On the morning of the inauguration, the sun broke through a soft winter sky. Ethan stood outside the polished doors in a tailored charcoal suit, holding a red ribbon in trembling fingers. Beside him, Lila beamed in a formal navy dress stitched with tiny gold stars. Her hair was brushed back with delicate curls, and around her wrist, a small bracelet shimmered. Not just jewelry, it was made from Ethan's old silver cufflinks, redesigned into hearts by a local artisan. He had given them to her the night before, saying, "Now my strength is always with you." A gentle crowd gathered, city leaders, old employees, mothers with children, news reporters. Mrs. Foster stood in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Ethan took the mic, his fingers curling around the edges like they did when nerves crept in. He looked at the sea of faces, then at Lila, who gave him a tiny thumbs up. "In another life, I thought success meant rising above others," he began, his voice steady. "But a little girl changed that, the day she helped me pick up scattered papers outside my building." He paused, emotions catching his throat. "She didn't know I had lost everything inside. She didn't know she was my everything." The crowd fell silent, hanging on each syllable like prayer beads. "She gave me back my world, without even knowing it." Applause swelled, but it wasn't loud, it was soft, reverent, like a hymn. Children clapped with tiny hands, single mothers clutched their hearts. Lila smiled proudly, standing taller than her years. Ethan reached down and offered her the ceremonial scissors. She giggled and held them with both hands, then turned to him. "Will you help me cut it, Daddy?" He swallowed hard, nodded, and together they sliced through the red ribbon. Confetti burst into the air like joy set free. The doors swung open behind them, revealing warm halls, playrooms, and safe beds. But outside, under the morning light, the real miracle had already happened. Reporters gathered, asking questions Ethan no longer felt the need to answer. All that mattered was the tiny hand still tucked into his. They walked through the crowd, greeting families who now had hope where once there was none. He shook hands with a boy who reminded him of himself at 10, alone, hungry for something more. In the foundation's atrium, a photo wall displayed Grace's smiling face. Below it, a plaque read, "Love builds legacies stronger than stone." Ethan paused there, and Lila touched the photo gently. "Mommy would have loved this place," she said softly. "She'd have built it herself," Ethan whispered back, voice catching. "But now, we build it together." Later that afternoon, the crowd thinned, the cameras left, and quiet returned. On the rooftop garden of the foundation, Ethan lifted Lila into the air as the sun set. Her laughter echoed through the sky, unburdened, pure. She stretched out her arms like wings, trusting completely. He spun her gently, saying, "You make the world worth spinning." And as the wind carried petals from nearby blossoms across the sky, she leaned close. "Daddy," she whispered, eyes twinkling like stars. He looked up, holding her against his chest. "Yes, my love? We're home now, right?" A single tear escaped his eye as he kissed her forehead. "Yes," he said, voice steady, sure and full of peace. "We're finally home." No skyscraper could ever mean more. No title, no boardroom, no empire. Just the sound of her heartbeat against his. Just the truth they finally lived out loud. No more secrets, no more waiting. Just a father, a daughter, and a love that rebuilt everything. And as the city lights flickered to life behind them, the heirloom wasn't jewelry, or wealth, or power, it was her. His daughter. His legacy. His beginning. His everything. Forever.